Go ahead and put something in the chat box to the right. We're going to give people a few more minutes to join on here before we get started. All right, let me know if you guys can see my slides, and if you can hear me. I see a few people on there, a few more joining. There's a chat box on the right-hand side. Okay, thanks, Nick. All right, Austin, you're not hearing anything? Maybe I wasn't talking at the time. All right, but if Nick, you said you can hear me? All right, so you guys got to check your settings on your end if you're not getting sound, because it's being, if one person's got it, it means it's going out. And we're going to get started here in just a few more minutes. So just make sure sometimes your browser will block some settings. All right, we'll get started in just another minute. Stragglers getting on here before we kick this off. Give everybody about 2 more minutes. So while we're waiting for other folks to join here and get things rolling, I will try to hold most questions until the end. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat here on the right-hand side. You can also enter questions on the bottom. The way my screen is set up, I won't see those questions on the bottom though if you put them in there, so probably best to use the chat. If I see it's something that really relates to what I'm talking about at the moment, I will refer to it, but otherwise I'll scan through it at the end if you have any questions. So the presentation tonight does kind of, it's not an advanced presentation, but it does take into account that you have a little bit of understanding of power training and FTP. We're not going to get so much into what FTP is, but if you have that question and you need to know that answer, you can go ahead and put that in, and I'll try to spend a little bit of time explaining what that is. But we're going to go through mostly what this process is that I use for my athletes, my triathletes, and in particular my athletes who do Ironman Lake Placid. All right, well, let's get going. See who's joined there. We'll get some stragglers at the end there. All right, so yeah, I see a lot of familiar faces and names on here. Most of you know me, but if you don't, a little bit about my background. I'm the head coach and founder of Bonkworks Endurance Sports. It's a coaching company located here in Syracuse, New York. I've been a lifelong endurance athlete for over 20 years. Basically started in BMX as a kid. Probably over 200 races, just about everything during that time period. I use SAC Level 2 coach, certified skills instructor, and a certified power coach. Assistant coach for the Northeast Talent ID Camp. This is a camp that's run by USA Cycling for both road and cross. I'm also a bike fitter and a race promoter. So I put on a series of cyclocross, fat bike races, a couple of charity races, some road races, a little bit of everything out there. All right. So I've been in this game for a long time. And I think, what I'm going to talk about a little bit tonight is kind of power being a way to train and power being a way to plan for these type of events. So in the title, I mentioned this by the numbers. So I want to explain a little bit about what I mean by the numbers. And there's really kind of two parts to this. One, it's using this power meter data to collect and baseline athlete performance. That's like your FTP tests, your VO2 max test, this collection process of getting that. So we're not going to really talk a lot about that tonight. But what we are going to talk about is this process to use that power data to plan, test, and ultimately race, and a little bit about kind of doing some post-mortem at the end of a race as well. So some of the tools I'm going to talk about tonight, obviously bike power meters. These come in all shapes and sizes nowadays. We got pedal-based ones, crank-based ones. There's smart trainers, hub-based, something new all the time coming out. For the running power, primarily the Stride foot pod is what I'll be talking about. It's the most accurate. There's not a lot of running power meters out there, but for the ones that are out there, the Stride is by far the most accurate running device, power device. So some of the tools I use for review and analysis, so I'm going to mention these here. I'm not going to get into demos on these, but just so you know what I'm talking about when I mention them. Training Peaks, so this is software used for scheduling, prescribing, creating workouts. It's also used for athlete and coach communications. Basically, I like to say it's kind of a fancy calendar system. WKO4, so WKO4 works closely with Training Peaks. It's what we call an analytical engine for analysis of physiological and power data. Kind of lets us slice and dice this data in a variety of different ways. Best Bike Split. So this is a web app. You can sign up for it. I recommend that you check it out. I use it for my athletes who are doing mostly longer distance events, but I use it for race planning and for race time analysis. And then Stride. Stride has their Power Center and their Power Race app, which communicates obviously with their foot pod for data and for power numbers. So why do we use power at all? Why is power such a great idea to use as opposed to other forms of measuring, other metrics that we use? It's really because it's really the best way to kind of quantify the true cost of an effort, right? So power is a true output metric. We like to say a watt is a watt. So by itself, it's not affected by weather, by sickness, all these type of things. Again, if you're putting out a watt, you're putting out a watt. So you may be sick, maybe you're going up a hill and you're putting out different wattages, but a watt is still a watt at the end of the day. So it's not affected by that type of stuff. So again, a great way to quantify. It also allows you to know what to expect in regards to your intensity, duration, and your frequency. And you can target those precisely. So you can build very precise workouts, get a precise measurement and analysis of what you put out, all through that power data, right? So this doesn't mean that I'm negative on heart rate or RPE, perceived exertion, but the difference really is, and so I pull out heart rate here because heart rate is very accessible to most athletes. They have a heart rate monitor, heart rate meter, and they know what that is. But the difference really is heart rate tells us how the heart is responding under stress, but not what that stress is, right? So your heart rate could be, you could be not even run a mile yet and you're nervous and your heart rate's really high, right? It's 183 beats. You haven't even taken a step yet, right? You don't really know. Well, maybe you know it's stress, but sometimes you don't know why that heart rate is high or why that heart rate is low. But on power, like you're climbing a hill and your heart in your watts and you're putting out 400 watts, well, you know why, right? And you're standing still or you're in a pace line and you're putting out certain watts, you really know why you are doing that, okay? But the way to look at this thing and to be very powerful is to tie power in with all these type of things: heart rate, pace, and RPE. So power, I like to say, is kind of a signpost that makes these other things make a little bit more sense. So we don't want to ignore those. They're all good metrics, but power really is the thing to kind of hang our hat on for really proper planning, analysis, testing, and race pacing. And so this is a good image. So I borrowed this image from Run with Power by Jim Vance. This is a kind of an introductory book on run power. But this really kind of shows how each of these are affected by a workload, right? So we have a runner going uphill, downhill, and on the flats. So heart rate, we're going up. The heart rate may have not gotten to the zone where we need it to be, right? So there's always a little bit of heart rate lag, especially if it's a real peaky type of hill or something like that takes a little bit for our heart rate to catch up to that effort, right? RPE, kind of follows it kind of closely, right? So, we know we're going up a hard hill, we feel it, and we're going downhill, we know it's easier, right? So this RPE, this perceived exertion, follows it pretty closely, right? So our RPE's, not a bad way to kind of keep track of things. Pace, on the other hand, we're trying to run a certain pace, right? Let's say we're trying to run a 7-minute mile. Are we able to stay at that? We're going up a big hill, long climb, or maybe it's a short, real steep climb. Well, we find it very hard to hold that pace. And then same thing, going down the hill. Well, again, are we able to hold that pace? So there's kind of this, workload that's kind of fading off. Like we're dropping pace and then we're going up the pace as we're going downhill. Where power, again, it's really following that workload, right? It's following the curve of that hill. We're going up the hill, the power's kind of coming up, going down the hill, power's dropping off, and then we're hitting the flats. And then we're kind of, right in the middle there on the flats. So again, a little way to elaborate, the difference between power, pace, RPE, and heart rate. So I'm going to jump in a little bit about the planning process. So this is kind of a high-level overview of the process that I use for my athletes for planning. And so there's 4 phases with this. This collect phase, which again, we're not going to really get into so much tonight. This is really about, collecting that data from the power meter, getting into Training Peaks, getting into WKO4, different methods that we use for that. But we're going to really focus on this plan and predict phase, how we're planning these races, what we're going to predict, what we're going to do in these races, specifically Placid, how we test that, not necessarily FTP testing or VO2 max testing, but how we're testing that plan. Is that plan that we built, is it accurate? Is it something I can actually do race day? And then, of course, we're going to talk a little bit about race day execution. So plan and predict on the bike. So the thing about the bike is I like to say the bike is kind of the Goldilocks of the disciplines come race day, right? It's not about the fastest time, but really about the strategy that leads to the overall best results, right? So we don't want to underbike. We don't want to overbike. We want to be kind of just right on the bike, okay? If we have stuff left in the tank, well, we're going to use it. We're going to use it on the run. So this plan and predict phase really breaks into 3 steps. And again, it's a very simplified way to look at it. But we're going to look at first, are you a strong cyclist and or are you a strong runner? And the two can't really be separated because obviously we're biking before we run and, we have to run after the bike. So these two have to be connected together for our planning purposes to do it right. Then we need to look at what's our goal on the bike. Right? Are we looking at a particular power we want to ride at? Are we looking at a particular percent of FTP that we want to ride at? So what's our goal? It could be a time. And then what's the course like? So we have to do some homework on the course. If you've done the course before, you're familiar with it. You know kind of what to expect. But if not, then you need to go out there. You kind of need to look at some of those things. And I'll explain some of the options that you have for doing that what I'll call the course data mining. So that's step 1. Are you a strong biker? So this is kind of how I look at somebody if they're a strong biker. And again, this is just my opinion. You're free to, you're free to disagree with it. But I look at these 3 points. 1, has the person trained the bike structured for more than 2 years? That means it's not just riding around your neighborhood, casually riding for a few years, but they followed some sort of structured training plan for 2 years. They understand how to do some of that. They have some familiarity with that, right? They have an FTP of 3.3 watts per kilogram or above, all right? So if you don't know what that is, that basically means if you're about a 200-pound person, you're about 300 watts, right? And if you're about 143 pounds, you're about 240 watts for your FTP, give or take, okay? So that gives you kind of an idea of what I consider a strong cyclist. And have you successfully completed that distance several times over the last 2 years? Have you ever biked that distance? If your longest ride is 50 miles, even if you have a strong FTP, yeah, you still may not be the strong biker is how I classify it. Now the run, similar. Have you trained some sort of run structure for more than 2 years? And I don't necessarily mean these that you've been coached for 2 years, but you followed some sort of organized plan. Can you run a marathon in under 3:20? And have you successfully completed 75% of that distance at least 3 times in those 2 years? All right. So again, that's kind of my benchmark, what I look at for a strong runner and a strong cyclist. Now that's step 2, as we start moving to that next step, that goal. What's the goal? What's the target on the bike? So we're gonna look at a couple of things here. First, one goal could be a wattage. I wanna ride a particular watts. I wanna ride 200 watts that day, or I wanna ride a percentage of my FTP. Maybe I wanna ride 75% of my FTP or 80% of my FTP. It could be a goal time. I wanna ride that distance in 6 hours or 5 hours. It could be cutoff time. You're just trying to make cutoff for the run or cutoff for the bike. So, all good options. TSS is primarily what I use. So TSS is what we call a total stress score, right? This is a representation of the intensity and duration of the event, really. And what this is it's a calculation of the training load, okay? So again, if I talk about the bike being Goldilocks, right, we want to make sure that we can kind of quantify what that training load is for the bike, and if that training load is appropriate for that athlete and appropriate for them to run afterwards, okay? So that's why I think training stress score is kind of the way to go, but all 3 are certainly options for planning. Now, as I mentioned, knowing the course is really important. So for Lake Placid, there's no shortage of resources to kind of find out things about the course. Strava, if you're on Strava, familiar with Strava, but there's tons of other apps, is a great resource. Obviously, you can see a course profile. You can see what other people have done. It breaks it into segments. You can see what their power was, what their heart rate, how fast or slow they went up those things. It gives you kind of an idea, what are you looking at? For race day? Is it a series of long climbs? Is it punchy climbs? Is there a lot of flat sections? So this is all stuff you got to take into consideration when you start doing your planning for a race like Lake Placid. Historical ride data. So this is, if you've ridden a course before, you did it last year, look, you can go back and you can look at this information, and I'll show you a way that you can pull this information in to kind of analyze it as well. But it also, if you go out and recon the course, or even part of the course, you go out and do you go up a few weeks early and you do 1 lap of it, or you do a couple laps of the course, you can have that historical ride data, kind of see where you fall, what's your power like, what's your heart rate like, what's those climbs like, what are those descents like. And then historical weather and forecast. Here's the thing, it's Adirondacks, it's Central New York, or it's not Central New York, sorry, it's Adirondacks, but it's in New York. So we know the weather is extremely variable, but look back. What is the historical temperature like? What's the weather normally like? What's the temperatures? What are the wind directions usually like? These are all things that you really need to factor in to kind of have a really good day there on the bike. All right, so as I mentioned, some of the tools that I use for this analysis, one of them is this Best Bike Split. So you can go on bestbikesplit.com and you can register and sign up for it. It's just a web app that's on there. But a few things I'm going to stress about Best Bike Split is your data needs to be accurate, okay? So your FTP, if you've never tested your FTP or you haven't tested your FTP in 6 months, it's probably a good idea to go out and test it. And so for most people, every 8 to 12 weeks, you may want to test it. If you've only been riding inside and now you're riding outside, you may want to retest it outside. If you're using a tool like WKO4, you can get some informal testing and get a better idea where you don't need to test quite so often. But that number is really important because obviously we're using power, and that FTP is kind of going to be this benchmark of how we're measuring our efforts. Bike weight, and this is not, oh, my bike is a 14-pound carbon fiber dream machine. This is, what's your bike like with hydration on board. How much does your bike weigh with all the, the tubes and spares and all that type of stuff on board? What's the true bike weight? All right, more accurate, the better. What's your weight? And I'm not talking your weight first thing in the morning after you got up and went to the bathroom. I'm talking about your weight with your helmet, your clothes, cycling shoes on. Again, get accurate type of stuff. Realistic aerodynamic data, okay? So not everybody is going to have access to having that aerodynamics data, but Best Bike Split allows you to put information about your bike in, and it will give kind of a manual calculation of what the aerodynamics of your bike are. So pretty cool, right? So if you have like a very high-end type of triathlon bike, like a Speed Concept or a Diamond, or something that has like an integrated cockpit that's on it, all the cable and everything is kind of hidden, and you have really high-end deep carbon fiber wheels, well, we'll call that like a super bike. All the way down to I just have a road bike. And so it gives you all these selections to put this information in there to kind of build up what your aerodynamics look like. It'll even ask you what width of tires you're running. Are you running 23 millimeter or you're running 25 millimeter, stuff like that. So the more information you get. You can also take bike fit data. As I mentioned, I'm a bike fitter, or you may go to another bike fitter or know a bike fitter. So you can get some information off your bike fit data to plug in and get some aerodynamics. You can use previous race data. It doesn't even necessarily have to be the Placid course. It could just be another long ride, and you can pull that ride data in, like a fit file in, and it will calculate what your aerodynamics is. So it doesn't expect you to do the math on it, but it will give you an idea of who you are as an athlete, what you look like on the bike, and then you can start planning from there. So as I mentioned before, you have a couple of options here for your goals, right? So step 2 was coming up with these goals. So first we have this normalized power goal. So if you're not familiar with normalized power, what this is normalized power is an estimate of the power that you could have maintained for the same physiological cost if your power output had been perfectly constant rather than variable. So that's a mouthful, right? So what I mean by perfectly constant is like if you were just riding at a steady state power inside on a trainer, right? It's a very steady state. It's very constant. There's no variability to it. There's no spikes in the power, as opposed to doing some sort of workout going outside where you may have these spikes in power. You may have this different variability. So normalized power is kind of a way to equalize what that cost would be, okay? Goal time model is what I mentioned before. Like you could have, I want to do it in X amount of time. I want to do it in 5.5 hours, 6 hours. I want to make cut off by a certain time. I'm going to put that goal time in there. As I said, I prefer a training stress score. Again, this is really calculating what our training load is. And opposed to normalized power, which is a great way to do it, like I could put a normalized power value in there and it may be too high, it may be too low. But the training stress, the fact that it will kind of calculate and quantify what that training load is, that's really the reason why I go that direction. And again, as it says here, an accurate FTP is required. We really need to know what that FTP is. So, and again, and I'll mention this at the end. If you need help with that type of stuff or help with testing, I'm here for that, okay? So all that type of stuff, once we get all that user data in there, all that bike data in there, we've figured out what our goal is. Now what we're gonna end up here is a power plan. So this is a very cool thing that, again, Best Bike Split does. And what it's done, again, is it's created a plan for the day. Now we have to kind of determine, is that plan appropriate for you? Is it appropriate for that athlete, right? So this plan here, what's neat about this as well, is you can download this plan. So you have this plan, it will download to your Garmin, it'll download to your Wahoo, your bike computer or your watch, and you could follow this plan come race day. And this plan could be as specific as dozens and dozens of intervals. So it'll tell you based on your GPS where you are in the course, I need to be doing this speed and this wattage. So it's very easy to follow, or you can pull some of the metrics on the side and just kind of follow it a little bit looser. But it's a way to kind of, as if you know who Joel Friel is, who's the guy who wrote the Athlete's Training Bible and the Triathlete's Training Bible, he said this is almost like, cheating with power. You can follow this so accurately. And if you know the right variables, it's almost impossible. It's still possible, but it's very hard to kind of overcook the bike. All right. But I'll show you some ways that it still is possible. So if we look at this athlete here, we're looking at, okay, sub 6 hours, average speed, normalized power, all that stuff. Okay, this seems realistic for this athlete. And I'm looking at what's called this variability index. So when I start looking at this variability index, now this is going to tell me some things about this athlete. So variability index is basically how evenly paced the effort was, okay? So for example, if I had a variability index of 1.0, that would be like a flat time trial, right? I just rode a flat, steady time trial. There's no hills, power was consistent, right? So here's the thing. This is not a flat course, so I don't expect a variability index to be 1.0. I expect it to be 1.05, 6, 7. What I don't expect it to be is 1.16, 17. That's like a bike race or a criterium or a mountain bike race, right? We don't want to have a mountain bike race come, Lake Placid bike split. It's not going to work well for us on the run, okay? Then, of course, we have our intensity factor, 0.69. So what that is a ratio between that normalized power and your FTP, right? So again, that's another metric that's going to kind of tell us how hard is this effort really is for this athlete. So if I rode, let's say my FTP was 300 watts and I did 300 watts for an hour, well, my intensity factor would be 1, right? So your FTP at an hour. So if I think of 0.69, that's a little bit lower than that, right? So that's telling me that this is kind of an endurance range. So that maybe that's a safe range to be in for this athlete. We want, obviously this is a long bike ride. It's not a bike race. It's not a mountain bike race. This guy's got to run afterwards. We need to be in a safe range, 0.69, safe range to be in. All right, so training stress score, as I said, we're kind of building this around there. We were targeting about a 280 stress score for this athlete. Well, lo and behold, after we crunched all the data, we ended up with a 281. I'm going to explain a little bit about how I know that number is a good number. So you're like, well, how is that number a good number? Where are you pulling that number out of? And I'll explain where that's coming from, and I'm not just kind of pulling it out of my hat. So we have some other data, watts per kilogram. And then we have some of the aerodynamic information, and that's not super important. We understand what the CDA is or the CR, the rolling resistance is. Those are just numbers, again, from that data that I populated in there for this athlete for their bike. So the other neat thing that Best Bike Split does, and that what we do in the planning for a race like Lake Placid, is we're going to look at some options of what can we do to kind of improve, or maybe we can improve. So we're going to look at a couple of things. So we have what's called this time analysis tab. And so again, that we were on that power plan before. There's a time analysis tab. It allows us to look at a couple of things. It allows us to change what the aerodynamics are. So let's say this gentleman had a regular road bike and then he bought a super bike and he got some, the drag went down. I could look at what that is. Let's say we want to ride it at a higher power. How does that affect him? Or he's gained or lost weight, or he went with this, he changed up tires. He's going with tubeless tires or tubular tires. He went from 22 millimeter tires and he's running 28 millimeter tires. I can kind of understand how all this stuff is going to affect this rider on that particular course. So in this case here's one scenario where I said, let's see what happens when we ride 12% higher power, right? So we look at this here and we can see there's a total gain in the green of almost 20 minutes. Like, wow, okay, 12% higher, I'm going to gain 20 minutes. That sounds pretty good. But now let's go over and look to the right and look at the race overview, the adjusted. Let's see what the effect is going to be on this athlete, right? So we look, okay, average speed, obviously, it's going to come up. We're riding harder. Time came down almost at 20 minutes. Everything's kind of come up. Ooh, variability stayed right where I want it to stay. But now intensity factor, boy, that's starting to get into a red zone. Now we're at this 0.8, right? As I mentioned before, 1.0, that's at your threshold. And for most people, they're going to hold that threshold power for about an hour. So, this is 5.5 hours. So getting close to that 1.0 number, unless you're a super strong cyclist, maybe it's not the way to go. Training stress score, this is the other thing. That's quite a jump, 281 to 355. So again, could this individual be getting into the red zone? So is he over biking that in this scenario? So in that case, yeah, probably. And again, I'll show you a little bit more how I know what that is. So again, creating that plan, looking at a couple of options on here. Here's another option to look at. So in this case here, power stayed the same, but as I mentioned before, well, he got himself a really nice, sweet bike we call the Speed Chicken. And so he's really fast on this bike. And I know it's a little bit squeezed on this slide, but what we can see here is he gained not as much time, but almost 11 minutes. That's still pretty solid. Variability stayed the same, 1.05. Intensity factor didn't go up a heck of a lot. That may still be a safe range for a strong cyclist. That's probably a good range. Training stress score didn't even go up that much either. So 281 to 294. So, okay, strong cyclist, this could be. He's gained a little bit on the aerodynamics. So this is one thing we've kind of learned about this course, about this Lake Placid course, is that it really is a course where aerodynamics come into effect. So having the aerodynamic bike will help you on this course, but with the caveat that you can stay aerodynamic on that bike. So I'll talk a little bit again about that. So aerodynamics, big. As we've done some analysis with athletes on here, actually dropping a few pounds off the athlete, believe it or not, didn't make that big of a difference. So here, power, raising their FTP, not necessarily riding harder, but let's say you spent time raising your FTP is a good bang for the buck. And again, aerodynamics, big bang for the buck come race day, all right? So these TSS numbers that I've talked about, this training stress score, okay? How do I know what these numbers are and what they mean and what are good ranges, okay? So this chart here, this is just a spreadsheet. This was originally developed by Joel Friel and Rick Ashburn. So I give them credit down here. I have a version of this that I've created on Excel. The calculations are pretty simple. It's really this relationship of this bike intensity, right? This ratio of my normalized power to my threshold power, right? So we saw that athlete, we had one, we had 69%. We had other one that was a little higher. And this gives us a TSS value. So again, what's our check and balance here? That's what this kind of works out to be. So in this case, this athlete, when we looked at him, 6 hours, 281, he ends up in this dark gray, right? So if I scan down here, it says, good range, right? So if I think of the other scenario, 355, even though he was down to 5.5 hours, all right, he's off the chart. He fell off the end of the world here. Most likely he's not going to be running too well after that. The other one that sort of falls in between, starting to fall in this 294 range, somewhere over here. All right, well, if he's a strong runner, strong cyclist, that could be totally doable. So again, if you need, you can Google this and usually find this calendar. If you need to figure out what the math is on it, it's really this intensity factor to power 2 times 100 times time times 100. That's how these numbers are popping up here. But again, I use it as a check and a balance. Are we with that athlete? And then again, going back to all those steps that I mentioned in the beginning, are you a strong cyclist? Are you a strong runner? So now I have to kind of say, how does this play together with these TSS scores? Is it realistic? Is this gentleman a strong cyclist? Is he a strong runner? Wow, he's a super strong cyclist. I could go harder. Or he's a really weak cyclist. He's a super strong runner. Then I can start kind of making my changes with that. And again, this is why power is such a great way to train and plan. So variability. So I had that variability. I mentioned that in a couple of slides ago with the variability 1.0 being a flat time trial, 1.16, 1.2 being like a mountain bike race. So I call variability kind of the silent killer of the run, all right? So variability is how evenly paced was the ride or the race. Did you stay where you were supposed to? Did you have a lot of surges? Every time there was a little rise in the road, did you get up out of the saddle and sprint it? Or did you kind of keep your power nice and smooth, right? So a high variability can certainly affect the run. So if we look at this particular one here, and this is a chart out of that WK04, that analytical engine. And so in this case here, I delineated some of this athlete's training zones. So the green line being zone 4 threshold, where his FTP value would be, zone 5 being basically where his VO2 max is. And as we can see, there are a lot of red spikes here. And I think somewhere when I calculated it up, it was like 900, maybe 1,000 spikes. So there was a lot of effort. Something was going on here that day. So I know it was windy, but there was some things going on where there was a lot of effort. So not really well paced. And so these are all going to cost this athlete. What we also kind of refer to these spikes as matches. So you may have heard this terminology like burning matches or matches burned. And so every time we're going up here, we're taking something out of the tank that we didn't have to. I mean, we really should see kind of the bulk of these spikes below this zone 4. And we're not seeing that. And so again, this is done either in training or this, in this case here, this was what I call like a post-mortem. This is something that we did analyze afterwards, after a race. All right, so some considerations about the bike. So obviously pacing is key, following that pacing and that power plan. Holding back on the climbs. You got to kind of know who you are in the climbs. You're hitting the climbs, even the short little punchy ones. It's like, you know, you can stay close to your power. And that plays into sometimes with the type of rider you are. Are you a high cadence or low cadence rider? Excuse me. Do you have the proper gearing on your bike? You know, if you're not good at the hills and you're running 1121 in the back, what we used to call a straight block in the old days, maybe that's not the best gearing for you. Maybe you need to look at other gearing. And at the same time, are you practicing those type of things in your testing? Are you riding hills? Are you riding hills that are similar? Okay. So, you know, you have to work on those neuromuscular requirements as well to be able to follow it. If you don't have that and you don't have that ability to be able to change those cadences, hold those powers on that undulating terrain, it's going to affect your pacing and it's going to affect your variability. So we also want to use your aero position effectively. So as I mentioned, aero is a big bang for the buck on the Placid course, but here's the thing. If you're under 16, 17 miles an hour, there's almost no advantage to your aero position, all right? So sucks for the people out there who have super fast bikes if you're not hitting that speed, but then don't be afraid if you're climbing, your speed drops below that to come up on the base bar and have to climb, all right? So, you know, aero usually trumps weight, but if your speed is dropping down, again, you're losing that advantage. So you might as well get out of the aero bars and stand and climb if your speed is dropping down. Certainly your speed's above that, big bang for the buck. So, you know, kind of a caveat to that, you know, bike fitting, you know, it can't be overstated. Get a good bike fit, make sure your position's good, give it some time to adapt to that bike fit position. Work on your head position as well. A lot of people, you know, they'll get on these nice time trial bikes. They'll have or triathlon bikes. They'll spend the money on the aero helmet, but then their head's sticking up the whole time. So you need to train that position. I'm not saying you need to be in a super tucked position the whole time. It's obviously it's a long day on a bike. You want to be comfortable, but you need to practice that, you know, effective aero position. All right, so moving on to this next phase here. So we talked a little bit about plan and predict, and we're going to talk about test. And again, I'm not necessarily talking about testing your FTP, but testing that plan, testing that prediction. Am I on the right path here? Is what I put together the right day, the right stuff for my race execution? So there's a saying, testing is training and training is testing, meaning that, you know, every workout is really a test and every test is really a workout. So don't be afraid to get the test in saying, well, I don't want to do my test today because I need to get such and such workout. And if you want to get accurate data, you need to kind of, the two blend together, right? But one of the things that's really important when we think about this, especially because of the length of the bike and the length of the run, is looking at how we perform after we burn a certain amount of energy. So how do you ride after you burn, as they say, X amount of kilojoules of energy, after burn X amount of calories, right? So I'm out there for a long time. So most triathletes at Ironman and Placid, they're burning over 3,000 kilojoules of energy. That's a lot, right? So we need to say, how do you ride? You may have that high FTP, but how are you holding that number after 3, 4, 5, 6 hours on the bike? Only one way you're going to know that is by getting some training rides in around those durations or doing some testing where you've burned off some energy and then you've held those values. All right. So, I'll give you some examples of those in just a moment. Build some workouts around that calculated normalized power intensity factor in TSS. So if we have a TSS of 281. Is that going to be too hard, too easy? Well, it's pretty easy for using something like Training Peaks or another program that's out there to build a workout, a structured power workout. Again, this is why I like power, to build this workout at that value. Ride it. Similar course. For those that are on the webinar that are in Central New York, Syracuse area, Syracuse 70.3 course, lots of hills, lots of descents. Some ways more elevation gain in a plastic course, but a good way to kind of go out and test that. How do you feel, when you do that? Nutrition and hydration plan. I'm not really getting into nutrition and hydration for this webinar, but if you're not eating and you're not drinking on the bike, then you know what? You're not going to be putting the power. You're not going to be putting the wattage out later. You're going to fade because of that. So that's important to make sure that that is part of the plan and part of the plan when you're testing. So here's some examples of some test workouts. So a beginner workout could be 30 minutes at zone 3 power. So this is, about 76 to 91% of your FTP. Spend 30 minutes at that. And then you're going to do a couple of intervals at that goal power. So whatever you come up with, like say, for example, you want to ride at 80%, or whatever you've determined using something like best bike split, you're going to do 4 by 20 minutes at that effort with 5-minute rest in between. These can be part of a brick, all these, and I'll show you the run ones you can do afterwards. Now we have an intermediate. So if you're a little bit stronger on the bike or feel you're a little bit stronger, you can do a 3 by 20 minute at sweet spot. So sweet spot is 88% of that FTP. And then you could add in some 5-minute rest there and then do 60 minutes at the goal power. So again, this is just a good way to test. Is that plan, what I'm doing, are those numbers, are they accurate? So if you're more advanced, you consider yourself a strong cyclist, 4 by 20 minutes at sweet spot. And then with 5-minute rest, and then kind of an intermediate effort at zone 3, again, at what we call tempo. So maybe not as hard as that sweet spot, which is still kind of zone 3-ish, down a little bit. And then you're going to finish with a 60 minutes at the goal power. All right. How are those numbers feel? All right. And then you're going to run. So we're going to talk about when we talk about the run power shortly, you're going to do some bricks afterwards and see how these kind of all fit together to see whether or not you've planned kind of properly for your race. Now, lo and behold, as we jump into run process here, follows kind of the same methodology. Again, we're going to not talk too much about the collection, but we're going to talk about the plan and prediction, how we're test that, and that race day execution. So plan and predict for run, as I like to say, and you probably heard this saying out there, bike for show, run for dough, right? So, if anything, it's probably always better to kind of lean a little bit more towards underbiking and use up what you have on the run. But again, it goes back, are you a strong cyclist? Are you a strong runner? But again, it follows the same 3-step process. Looking at, again, your strengths on a bike or run, what's the goal for the run? So the goals are going to be a little bit different, but still could be percent of FTP, could be pace, could be time. What's the course like? Again, you need to do your homework to see what the course is like. Where are the hills? Where are the descents? What's the elevation like? So a quick introduction on run power. So run power is pretty new. So, hopefully most of you have heard of run power before. So I like to say run power is the same but different than bike power. And what I mean by that is when we measure run power, we're actually looking at power in kind of 3 directions or 3 dimensions. It's not only just power going forward like we are on a bike, but we're looking at horizontal and vertical power as well too. And we're also looking at run form metrics. And so these affect us on the run and it affects our run power. So one way to look at this is as you fatigue in the run, your power could actually go up because what we have a thing called a running effectiveness could actually decrease where you're not using as much power to generate to propel you forward. And so you would think, oh, well, I'm running slower, my power should go down. But no, we have to factor in run effectiveness. So it's a little bit of a different way to look at it. So, so again, we factor that in to see what we're going to do on a run and when we get into our goal planning. And coming up this spring, by the way, got a little side note here. I will have an introductory presentation on run power. We'll cover a little bit more of what some of these metrics are. So again, into the steps. So again, just my opinion on what a strong runner is, very similar to the bike. Have you trained to run, done some sort of structured running for more than 2 years, followed some sort of plan? Can you run a marathon in under 3:20? And have you successfully completed 75% of that distance at least 3 times over the last 2 years? All right. That to me is what I would consider a strong runner. All right. Now those goals and targets. So we're not going to really like the bike that we had, the TSS, normalized power. Here it's a little bit, in some cases, a little bit simpler. We can, of course, we can look at wattage because we're still generating a watt number, or percent of FTP. That's usually what I will do my planning on, is percent of FTP. But of course, it can be goal time, cutoff time, could be a goal pace. And again, running power and pace play really well together. So always tying the two is a great method as well. As I said, doing your homework on the course. So, you can use Strava. This image here is right from the Ironman website, but get an idea, what am I looking at for the run? Do I have hills? Do I need to practice some hills? Do I have some historical data? What's the weather like? What's the forecast like? Obviously, this has got some hills. It's got some descent. It's got some fast areas. I need to kind of duplicate this in my testing, and I need to duplicate this in my training. So for run planning, we don't have a fancy program available like Best Bike Split. So we kind of default to the good old-fashioned spreadsheet. There's a variety of these run power calculators out there. There's a couple of websites that have some stuff. This one here is from Chris Haig, who's part of the Stride team, and he refers to it as the Watts That Win. I like this one in particular because it's a really simplified kind of way to plan our run power. We simply need a few different things, but just like bike, we need to make sure stuff is accurate, right? Our run FTP, our run critical power needs to be accurate, right? So we need to test, and we need to test on, often enough that we know that's a number that we can hang our hat on, that the number is accurate. So in this case here, we had a goal time 3:20. Of course, we put the race distance in. Now we have an expected running effectiveness of 1.0. So again, this is a number, if you use a tool like WKO4, you can come up with, but if you have no idea what's, running effectiveness, there's a little chart down here, right? So again, this is about, converting that external power into speed. And so if you're an elite runner, and I mean, you're an elite runner, you're a pro, you're probably in a 1.01. But if you're most of us, you're somewhere 1.00 or 0.99. So again, if you're a weak runner, you're going to use like the 0.99 type of calculations. You're a strong intermediate runner, you've run some marathons, you're relatively decent time, the 1.0 is a measurement that you're going to go. And again, that expected RE is all about how you convert that power, your run power, into speed, right? Are you an effective runner? Or do you have some other kind of like fatigue or biomechanical issues that are preventing you from, really putting out the speed in the run? Of course, you need an accurate weight. And as I mentioned, the FTP or critical power in here. So what this calculator here does is it comes up with all those metrics in here, all those numbers in here, what we call a target power. So here's our target power for this athlete, 262. Gives me a percent, again, of FTP. That's what we're going to base this athlete on. 81.9. I have kind of a little bit of notes down here that this is for an Ironman. I want to be somewhere between 80 to 85%. If they're a weaker runner, I am going to be more towards the 80%, maybe a little under. If they're stronger, I'm going to go the other way. So for this rider or this runner here, this athlete here, 81.9, based on what they've run in the past, is a doable value. So we're going to stick with that number. So some considerations on it. Actually, let me jump back one slide. With the run power, one thing I also kind of recommend, and I'll talk about this on the next slide, is actually coming up with 2 power values. So we have this one here. This is our target. But sometimes things don't go as planned, right? So we don't fuel right. we overbike, something happens, it was windy, it stormed, whatever, you got a flat tire, something happened out there. So I always recommend coming up with at least the second, if not a third power value that you can kind of hang your hat on to say, okay, if something didn't go well, I'm out there running and I'm not feeling it. What's kind of my plan B? What's my bailout power? And you can come up with a number that's a little bit lower, maybe in the 75% range. And then you can kind of hang your hat on that for your pacing. So, have kind of a plan B for that. So into the run considerations. For the run, pacing is key, right? The longer you can run, if you're not doing, this less walking you have to do. Combining that power with the RPE. So combining that power with the perceived exertion. How do you feel? So when you're out there and you're running and you're doing your testing and you're doing your bricks and you're looking at those power numbers and whether your coach is coming up with them or you're generating what those zones should be, how do you feel? That's really important for the run. Are those two really, are they corresponding? I like to go with the 10% rule for the run power as well, or I say 10% and under. You can use this for bike as well on the climbs. So as you're running up the hill, this means that your power value is going to go up as you're going up a hill, and it's going to come down a little bit as you're going down the hill, just like it does on a bike a little bit, but staying within 10% of what you set your goal power to be. So that athlete was 262. We're going to stay right around that 10, give or take plus or minus 10% is a good way to pace it. So stay disciplined on that. You may see people really drilling it on that first part, really drilling it on those first hills, and you're going to stay disciplined, right? You're going to follow that plan, see how you feel, that perceived exertion, and pace yourself. And again, as I mentioned before, 2 power goals, is optimal, I think, for that. So that's the plan and prediction part. So now we want to test this just like we did for the bike, right? We want to test it. We want to make sure that that plan is going to work for us come race day. We don't want to show up there race day and say we have these numbers. We've spent the time. We bought this stride power meter. We bought this bike power meter. We have no idea, are those numbers even accurate? So lo and behold, we want to test this before race day and usually far enough advance it, of race day that we can make some changes if we need to make those changes. So again, not necessarily FTP testing, but again, testing the plan. So I do recommend that when you're testing out your plan in your run numbers that you bike before you do those tests. Matter of fact, if you're doing a run FTP or critical power test, I've now started to do that with my own athletes. They're doing a bike ride before they do that test. Again, we're simulating, you're triathletes. You're going to bike before you run. So why not test that way? It's going to give us better and more accurate data. Once you come up with those numbers, like in this case, approximately 82%, do some open runs. Just do some regular runs at that. How does that feel? Do some bricks at that run. Again, you're going out and testing that plan. So, and practice that pacing. The run power is new. Getting used to having that app on your watch is going to take a little bit of practice. You don't want to have to do that come race day trying to follow that run power. And besides the Stride Power app, there's a few other ones that are out there too. Garmin, you could add a Garmin Power Field as well, but practice all that. Practice the technology as well as those efforts before race day. Now, here's some test workouts that I think work well for the athletes, especially ones who are doing Placid, and these go well with the bike ones that I had. So hopefully you're taking some notes and you'll have that information, but these can be done as bricks. I recommend that you do them as bricks. So for beginner, 3x3 miles at goal power. So you come up with that, for example, that athlete at the 82%, going to do 3 miles at that power, 1 minute easy in between each of those 3 mile efforts. Intermediate, a little bit more, 2x5. And of course, the advanced, you're going to push it a little bit more, 3x4, 1 minute easy between each of those. All right. Again, just to check to see, am I on target? Are my numbers good? Am I on the right track? So we've gone through all those, plan and predict, the test, how we're testing our plan. So I want to touch base a little bit here on race day execution and a little bit of how things kind of can work together and how sometimes things don't always go as planned. So here's a race day comparison between 2 athletes that I had at Lake Placid. All right. So on the surface, when we look at these, they look pretty solid, right? So obviously the rider on the right, the triathlete on the right, a little faster than the one on the left. But there's a few things that kind of pop up here as red flags, okay? And so here's a little secret, here's a little hint. The one on the left here is the one that had the high variability. And I can also look at that when I start looking at this VI, right? VI of 1.16. So if you're looking at this workout and you can see that on your screen, you see that VI number 1.16. If you remember what I said earlier, somewhere between 1.05, that's what we planned. Maybe up to 1.07 is where we wanted to be, all right? Intensity factor. We had looked for 0.69. We ended up with 0.82. So a little bit harder. And you know what? The person paid for a little bit maybe on the run because of this, right? So what this ended up doing is we had a much higher TSS number. So we were targeting a particular TSS number. Well, we went way above that number with that. So now if we look at the rider triathlete here on the right, how they wrote it, intensity factor. This is a person who's a fairly strong cyclist, 0.72, spot on. Of course, I said that, Lake Placid, the route is not flat. I don't expect it to be a 1.0, but look at that variability, 1.07. That is really well paced. That takes some experience. This is a pretty well experienced triathlete, somebody who's done this course multiple times. So again, it just takes some practice. It takes some planning to get at that. So as I mentioned, as you can imagine by looking at these numbers, this rider here, this triathlete, riders, I still got the bike race from last night in my head, had a much better run than the one on the left, the one on the left. All right, so a little bit post-mortem on race day. Did you hit your numbers? So in some cases, maybe we did, some cases we didn't. And in that case, we need to go back and say what worked, what didn't. So that triathlete on the left, on the surface, we looked at some things. It looked like, okay, we were close on some things, but what didn't work? Why didn't it work? Obviously, in this case, it was the variability. There was some pacing. Whether the athlete didn't feel good that day, whether it was weather, we got to kind of figure out what kind of happened, where we can improve. Did I overbike or did I bonk? I hate that term, but it's there, right? So did I bonk on the bike? Did I not fuel right? We didn't talk about swim, of course, but the swim can and will affect the intensity factor on the bike. So we need to kind of keep that in mind as we're kind of predicting some of this stuff here. That's why we want to kind of go towards maybe the safe end and say, okay, we could go a little bit higher on this TSS. We could go a little bit harder on the bike, but oh boy, we need to, we have to swim ahead of time. And so we have to factor that in. So that 10% and under rule, did we stick to that or did we kind of blow that up? Were we going super hard on those hills? Were we trying to chase down everybody on the hills? There's my rabbit and I'm going after that person. If you feel good and you can do it, fine, but usually staying disciplined, especially on the bike, is going to pay off on the run, even for weaker runners. We found this out. So this is a term that one of my athletes had mentioned to me in a comment the other day, but it goes with kind of having those different run power, having those two different power and tying kind of everything together with your pacing and your perceived exertion. Here's the thing, you get in, everything's gone well, you got 5-6 miles left, you feel good, numbers are good, you've hydrated and you've eaten properly all day. You know what? Maybe stop looking at the power because you've practiced this with that perceived exertion. You've practiced it with how you felt. Go for it. Put the power down at that point and have fun with it. So again, I like that term. Smoke them if you got them on the run, at the end of the run, not 2 miles in on the run. Maybe not the best plan there, but 5-6 miles left, 4 miles left. Absolutely, if you're feeling good, go ahead, do it. All right, so with that, we're sort of wrapping up here and stayed pretty close to the time. Hopefully I got a tendency sometimes to talk a little fast. So hopefully I didn't go through. I know it's a lot of stuff on power, maybe some unfamiliar terms. This is a good time to kind of open up the questions in chat if people have them. Use the chat box on the right. If you have them, I probably wouldn't use the open questions on the bottom, but if you have anything, go ahead and shoot it over to me now. Give a few more minutes for any questions. And so, like, as I mentioned, there's I'm around for further questions. If you think of something afterwards and you want to know a little bit more. So that's a good question. So Austin, question on power pedal I prefer. So I have a lot of athletes who use the power tap pedal. Price point, that was always a good option for people. I don't know what kind of flux they're in right now because they were just bought by Quark. And Quark is owned by SRAM and owns Zip. So I think that's a good move for them. But, those tend to be a good bang for the buck. As far as like the Garmin Vectors, I would stay away from the Garmin Vector 2. Sometimes you'll see those up for sale cheaply, but they've had a lot of problems with it. The Garmin Vector 3s aren't too bad. It also comes down to if you have kind of a preferred pedal system. I'm a fan of Speed Play pedals, and they don't make a power-based pedal system. So, if I use a crankbase, I use the Quark crankbase sensor. Sometimes people ask, do they need to have, you kind of took my words out of a dual-sided versus single-sided. So certainly if you can afford it, dual-sided is a great option to have. But you also need to be able to make sense of the data that the dual-sided gives you. So we look and we say, okay, an athlete has 40% on one side, 60% on the other side. And this is what I'm talking about, is true dual-sided power. So some systems will say they're dual-sided power, but they're just duplicating the power, so not true dual-sided power. So you need to make sure that they're true dual-sided power when you're buying a power meter. So if I have an athlete that has that, then we have to determine, what are we going to do? Is it a bike fit? Is it a strength issue? How are we going to do that? So once we know that and we're kind of doing some things with that, that data isn't quite maybe as important as it is initially. So, again, if you can afford it, good to go. But if you can't, I wouldn't worry about it. The other thing the dual power stuff is good at is if we look at the neuromuscular demands of an event. And I mentioned a little bit about that, this high cadence, low cadence type of stuff. So we can look at that and say, for the most part, most triathlons are going to be, low force, high velocity, people who are doing, high cadence type of stuff. So we can look at that type of stuff and see, it's called what we call a quadrant analysis, to see where you're falling. Are you doing those type of efforts in your training? Are you duplicating those neuromuscular, not just the physiological, but these neuromuscular demands of the event? And so dual-sided gives us that. But again, if budget doesn't allow, single-sided is fine. What else? So, for the most part, yes. On as far as the give the push, the last mile on the run, behave on the bike. As I said before, kind of, the bike is kind of the Goldilocks, right? So, and depending on how strong of a biker are you and what's the distance, obviously shorter triathlon events, you can put a little bit more effort in the bike. But really having this kind of balance on the bike where it's not too much, it's not too little, and kind of saving what you have in the tank for the run. You can always use it up on the run, whether you're a strong runner or you're a weak runner. There is always time to use that up on the run. So yes, I for the most part say behave on the bike and then spend those dollars, empty that tank a little bit more on the run. So I had a question too that's not on here, but somebody asked, what's the latest you should do an FTP test in the season prior to a race? So hopefully you've been testing relatively periodically. So you certainly want to test at least maybe 3-4 weeks out. You don't need to test a week before. You don't want to do, as you're tapering down, the 2 weeks, usually 2-week taper. Almost all research says no matter what the distance of the event is, 2-week taper is optimal. So we certainly want to get our testing in before that. If you've changed up bikes, if you've changed power meters, things like that, you're going to want to retest as well too. So, try to get a test in maybe, at the minimum, 3 or 4 weeks out is probably not a bad idea, depending on what you've been doing. Again, I use WKO4 for my athletes. I don't have to always formally test. Sometimes my workouts are super sneaky and are kind of a test anyways. So I'll get some of that data. But, again, test periodically. Stay on top of it, especially as you're getting stronger and you're getting fitter and you're getting into, more of a build phase or race phase of your plan. All right, what else we got? Any other questions? All right, well, I appreciate everybody joining me tonight. Hopefully this was beneficial to everybody. Again, as I mentioned, if you got any further questions, go ahead and shoot them over to me. You got coach@bonkworks.com. The webinar link should be emailed you in a couple hours. It takes a little bit of time to process it. And I believe we'll also get it up to YouTube. Check us out on Facebook. Unless you're a teenager, then you're not on Facebook. So, but we're on Facebook. I post a lot of stuff on there, of course, on Instagram as well. And if you need help with that, we provide, obviously, coaching, but we also do power analysis, race analysis for people who don't want to do full coaching, but want somebody to kind of go through and deep dive on their data. We're there to help. Also, we can do some FTP testing as you want as well, too, for both run and power and help you with that. All right. So thank you, everybody. Have a great night. Talk to you soon.